is vegan, which means that it's vegetarian. What we buy is vegetarian, and then if we dumpster stuff or get stuff from the food bank, then we get meat out of that.
But do you cull any of your cows, or do you
We
raise rabbits
absolutely
for
cull,
meat and stuff
right.
like that?
So this gets at a super important idea. So Twin Oaks is what's called an embrace diversity community, which means as much as possible we don't tell our members what to do. So we don't say, for example, you have to stop smoking cigarettes, you have to be a vegetarian, you have to worship Buddha, you have to send your kid to homeschooling. Like, as much as we can avoid those dictates, we avoid them. And in the 80s, Twin Oaks went through a very intense period called the Food Wars, where there were people who really wanted us to move to an all-vegetarian diet, because that's best for the planet, and it's more humane, and blah, 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 blah. And those people lost the Food Wars. They lost to the, I don't want you telling me what it is that I should eat, because I have figured out, because of spiritual reasons or health reasons or whatever, that these are the appropriate things for me to eat. And so largely Twin Oaks doesn't tell people what to do. Lots of communities, especially smaller communities, are much more comfortable saying, we're meditating every day at 5 o'clock. You better be there, right? Or we're all vegetarians, right? Or we don't believe in the public school system and we're educating our kids ourselves, right? What Twin Oaks is saying is, you don't have to get your clothes from Common Clothes, right? You don't have to come to these holidays that the community is throwing. You don't have to do any particular work. You don't have to stop smoking cigarettes. You have to make your 42 hours. We're intolerant of intolerance, but it's embrace diversity services. Please. So you're asking. I want you to ask questions. I want you to ask questions and not talk about yourself. If that's okay.
Oh, I had a question.
Then I'm gonna let you think about asking.
One of the other questions I have is, how well do you get along with the local communities? Because I know in the history of intentional communities, it hasn't always been so smooth necessarily.
This is a great question, right? So the people in Twin Oaks identify sort of on a spectrum from radical anarchists to liberals, and almost all of our neighbors are conservatives, right? There are lots of Trump yard signs around our community at the 2016 election, right? Which would initially appear to be a point of tension. But Twin Oaks is super concerned about its local relations, so we did a number of things to ease those tensions. One of the things that we did is we do all of our banking and most of our shopping locally. So the people in the area see us as an economic benefit and a social benefit. We also do a bunch of volunteering, so there are people who are, EMTs and people who are in crisis hotlines and people who go to local churches and these kinds of things. But it turns out one of the things that was most important that we didn't plan is that we're surrounded by agricultural entities, right? Lots of different kinds of farms around us. And what these farms experience is that the family farms have trouble keeping the kids there, right? The kids don't want to stay working on the farm. Turns out farming is crazy hard work, right? But Twin Oaks brings young people in, and one of the most visible things that we're doing is farming. So we connect with a lot of our neighbors around the farming stuff, including lending of equipment and that kind of stuff. And we also have people who are on goodwill missions, and when we have a surplus of watermelons, we go around the block, which is huge, it's a 2-mile block, and we give our neighbors watermelons. Oh, thank you so much for the watermelons. But so local relations are important to us. A number of people think we're a little odd, but our local relationships are generally speaking pretty good. Please.
Have you inspired other
Yes.
intentional communities?
Yes. So Twin Oaks was the first egalitarian community in the United States, and now there are about a dozen other communities that are egalitarian. None of them use the same decision-making model that we use, the planner-manager model. Almost all of them use consensus. There's a big community in Missouri called East Wind that uses this sort of interesting anarchist voting thing that they do. But there are about 24 communities in the United States that can attribute some significant part of their heritage to this model.
And why do you think there are more?
Why do I think there aren't more?
Yeah.
Because there's $1 trillion a year industry that's designed to keep you from sharing stuff. And if you weren't watching these ads with these beautiful models who are all hoarding their stuff, maybe you would think, hey, I'd like to work less and have more. If I can just share things. Well, that sounds like a great idea. Please.
I was wondering what kind of resources there are for spirituality, or if there are any spiritual types of events that people put together there, that sort of thing. Just curious.
So if there was a state religion, there would be paganism, right? Because we have a farm and we celebrate the harvest holiday. So we have a big May Day celebration, the equinoxes and solstices, and the Samhain, which is Halloween. So there are secular rituals that are inspired from the pagan culture, right? And they are optional. You don't have to go. The interesting thing is some of the stronger pagans are like, it's a little too secular for us. So it's not uncommon for us to have two May Day celebrations for this. The big May Day Maypole one where everybody will be there and it's open to the public, and then there'll be a smaller, more dedicated, more highly pagan ritual that's done by people who probably also went to that other one. And you know, the intolerance of intolerance includes we're not willing to discriminate against anybody's religious beliefs, and so there are lots of representations of different spiritualities. There's some Christians, there's some Buddhists, there are people who go to the nearby church. Yeah.
What about tolerance? Or rather, intolerance of intolerance.
That's what they don't do.
Of intolerance.
That's what they don't do. He said that's right.
What do you think?
Guns. How do y'all have a gun?
Guns,
a gun lock on?
Guns like broadcast television is long-term ban. The community owns a gun for putting down cows for the meat that we make, and the gun has 2 locks, and 2 different people have the keys. But basically, we have a long-standing prohibition on guns, which interestingly causes some people to not consider us as a place that they want to live. There are some people who feel like, if I'm going to move to an intentional community, I need to have my gun.
Yeah.
So it's a self-solving problem.
It's a self-solving problem unless there was somebody who had that belief that we really, really wanted.
Let me interject with a quick question. Is there anyone who objects to continuing on? I know we are over our time. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate your patience. We've run quite long. Neither Willow nor I would be offended.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
I don't think we're stopping quite yet. I was just asking if there were any objections.
Yeah. Please feel free to leave anytime. But I do want to encourage you, if you're in Central Virginia near Charlottesville, see if you can get you in touch with me. Happy to have you come down, give you a little tour. We do regular tours on Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. And this communities conference, if you're interested not just in Twin Oaks, but in potentially a collection of communities, about 50 different communities come, and that's over the Labor Day weekend.
So when you have public events where people around you come, like the May Day and things like that?
Yes, we have. Yes, so Twin Oaks has 2 different kinds of internal parties.
Mm-hmm.
We have parties that are public, in which we bring in folks from outside, like our anniversary, like May Day, like the New Year's event, and then we have other celebrations that are mostly for us and maybe the surrounding communities. There are 5 other communities in the county that we're in.
Individual households have parties.
And individual households have parties. And certainly, you can have your own private birthday party, and you can take over a public space and have your own private birthday party.
Yeah, just a comment. There are still a few uncivilized groups, indigenous people. They're usually in Africa, some in South America, and they have an organization very similar to what you're talking about. They usually aren't over 100 people. If somebody shoots a boar and brings it back, it's not his, it's the community's, and he doesn't get anything to say about what happens to it. And if they are growing crops, it's like, it's everyone. You know, it's not my piece of land or anything.
Right.
And there's a real similarity to,
Right, well, the private property notion is actually a relatively contemporary idea.
yeah,
Right? Like, sharing things makes a lot of sense. You probably don't need the whole boar, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
other people would like to eat, right? And you maybe can't do something that somebody else can do, and if you're working cooperatively. Right, so again, gets back to this idea behind access and ownership. You've been convinced that you have to have ownership, but really what you want is access.
Well, it basically for thousands and thousands of years prior to the nation state building and city states, this is what the world had.
You're back to John Lennon's Imagine,
Yeah.
right? No countries.
And it worked, you know.
It did work, and it worked in a world that wasn't as obsessed with technological development, right?
Yeah.
Like the market is good at making widgets. Right? It's also bad at making pollution.
It's nuts.
Right? But these the economic model that we have now is sort of driven by consumer behavior, not by collective consumption patterns, but by what you as an individual want. So
That's a neat, yeah, that's a neat distinction, yeah.
My mom has
Well,
a question.
Go ahead, Susie.
I wanted to remind you, if you don't mind, to touch a bit on the gender culture, because I think it's
Sure.
really fascinating.
Yeah. So somebody asked me before about gender balance. We actually, one of the things that we have in place that has not
Everybody's the same gender at Twin Oaks.
that has not been activated in the time that I've been Twin Oaks, but we come close. If we ever are out of whack in gender balance by more, one gender is dominating more than 60%, then we stop accepting folks from that gender until we move back into parity. Now this policy comes from the 60s and 70s, which of course has been tremendously complicated in the world of gender fluid and transgender individuals, right? So how do we count those? And the way that we count them is whatever way makes it harder for us, right? Like if you're concerned about gender imbalance, then anybody who might be creating that imbalance gets counted. So if we need to do something about it, we get the warning early. And Twin Oaks is relatively good about dynamic gender issues. We have some transgender members who tell us that there's lots of stuff that we need to do to be more transgender friendly. We have a number of gender fluid individuals. And interestingly, Twin Oaks, there's lots of talk now about using they as a gender neutral pronoun. Twin Oaks, back in '67, in our bylaws, was using co as a gender neutral pronoun. In place of he or she, we use the word co. Which leads to all kinds of funny sentences like, he's your co, right? Like where somebody said that, like, this is your person, right?
That's what Co said.
Right, that's what Co said. So gender issues have been important to us. Part of egalitarianism is getting away from this idea that there's women's work and men's work. Like everybody can be trained in any kind of work that is there in the community. And gender issues are crazy tricky, right? Like one of the things that Twin Oaks organizes is a women's gathering, and there's this question of how inclusive is it of people who are transgender, and this has been the source of lots of frustration. My Dutch wife and Willow's mom has done a bunch of work on this. So we're in better shape than many places, and there's still lots of work to do. It's really
So is like every gender called Co, or?
so increasingly people are identifying themselves by and saying what kind of pronoun they want to be identified with. So when I say, my name is Pax, they, them pronouns, right? And if you look at my bio here, it has they, them instead of he.
So
It is.
like, do you always use Co instead of he or she, or?
He was just saying
He
that.
just said that.
You don't, yeah.
They just said that.
They just said
part of making mistakes, part of living in community is is not being rigid about people making mistakes, trying to be forgiving. Did you have a question?
Along the same lines as the gender thing, how about the different age ranges? Is there an effort to keep the community diverse with the different age ranges?
Yes,
Yeah.
there's a policy which I hate, which I'll tell you about. When the average age of the community is above 40, then we put an extra step in the membership process for people who are over 54. And this extra step is very small. Everything looks the same. You apply for your 3-week visit, and then you say, oh, hey, I'm over 54. Will you consider my membership? And the community says yes or no. And it says yes. Then you go through the regular process and it says no, you're done. Now, this policy is not particularly effective at reducing the average age of people who come, because we know what it looks like when it's turned off, and we know what it looks like when it's turned on. It's extraordinarily effective at getting people to say, oh, Twin Oaks is ages, right? Like, it is epic bad PR. And as somebody who's out there in the PR business for us, I wish we would get rid of this policy. I've spoken
America is ages.
vociferously against it, and so far have not been listened to.
So if someone is over that age range and applies, can they inquire if an extra step is going to be taken in their application process?
Oh, you'll get told. So you send a letter answering a bunch of questions, one of which is your age, and if you're over 50, if you're over 54, you'll get the whole outline. That will spark it.
So 58, I
That's not true, right? So part of it, part of the reason that you need to keep this in mind is because of the thing that I said much earlier that you've probably forgotten, which is that there's a graduated pension program. So if you're 58, instead of having a 42-hour pension, you're going to have a 33-hour pension, right? Like, you're going to get 9 hours off as pension because of your age, right? Like, what we don't want to do is we don't want to say, you're old, you don't work anymore. Right? So what we want to do is we want to slowly ramp it down so that even the people who are old in the community feel like full members, right? Like, we don't want to create this dual class thing where, oh, you're an old retired person and therefore less valuable. It's like, no, you're still contributing to the community. It's reduced because you're older. That seems fair. That seems reasonable. But you're still very much a member of the community.
Is your extra step in place now?
The extra step is in place right now.
My question is we also talked about how the education process works for members who want to enter college. What happens if you have someone who is in their 30s or 40s or 50s who wants to go to college? Do you help with them?
Yeah,
as well?
we do. So the answer to that question has a fork. So if I wanted to take a marketing class, which I have done, because I'm in the business, easy peasy. If you wanted to take a philosophy class, or if you wanted to get a philosophy PhD, right, which currently, unfortunately, doesn't have much application, then you'd have to go through a process with the community. You have to talk with the community about how to do it, how you're going to make quota while you're still doing this, those kinds of things. And we do send adults to non-income generating educational stuff as is desired. But again, it's a little bit like the question of, like, could I be a therapist in town 5 days a week? You could be, but the reason that you're at the community probably is because the services and the activities that are happening there are drawing you to be there.
Is there an upper age limit to membership, to being accepted as a member?
Unless the extra step is in place.
No, when the extra step is in place, really all we're doing is we're jumping ahead on the decision, would we accept you anyway? Right? Like, people don't say, oh, you're 67, so that's a no. They say, oh, Kathy's wonderful. I want Kathy. I don't care what age Kathy is. Which is exactly the same decision that we would be making if the step was not in place. Which is why the policy is so stupid. Right? So, other reasons not to like this community, rant here. Twin Oaks So 19 out of 20 communities fail inside of the first 3 years that they exist. So Twin Oaks hasn't failed. What it does is it puts in place a culture that has a fear of change. Right? Like if we change any of the variables, we might become one of those failure statistics, right? Like if we started saying, oh, television's allowed, or oh, 70-year-old people can apply for membership without this extra step, or if you change any rule, bad things might happen. Right? Twin Oaks is not going out of business. Not with 7 businesses, not with $2 million in the bank, not with 100 members, not with 480 acres, not with 50 years of history. We are not going out of business. We could be daring. And some say we actually have a revolutionary obligation to be daring because we have the capacity to try bold things. We should try bold things. That is not what we do.
That's not, but you're not one of those people who says that.
And this is part of why I'm also connected with these smaller communities, because the smaller communities are willing to take risks and do experiments. They're less fear averse, less change averse.
What's your growth rate? I mean, obviously you can't stay at 100 members for forever, but you know what I'm saying? Are you going over that slowly, or are you slowly growing?
So the algorithm used to be, for the first sort of 40 years of the community's life, the algorithm used to be the number of members that we can have is equal to the number of bedrooms, less the number of kid bedrooms that we have. So when we reached our population cap, and we had a waiting list for a while, we'd build another building, right? And we did that for the first 40 years of the community's life. We just kept building buildings as we needed them. Over the last 8 years, we've been at our population cap for 6 of the last 8 years, and we haven't had a serious conversation about building another building. What we did 24 years ago, when we were at our population cap, and we had a bunch of money, and we had a bunch of people on the waiting list, is we started Acorn. We gave them $250,000, we set them 7 miles away, we said you can do whatever you want to do as long as you do the egalitarian thing. And now there are 4 other communities of that type in the county with us, right? So we've sort of stopped growing and we've started spawning. If you look at it that way.
Morphine,
Yeah.
cloning.
But just to be clear, Twin Oaks is still accepting member applications.
Twin Oaks is still, and we're not at our population cap right now. So you could come to
Well,
a 3-week
I was
visitor
just
period.
curious down, you know, and the long sight of your vision. You know.
But getting to the flow question, about 20 members a year leave. So about one,
Does that include
between a
children?
fourth and a fifth of the adult population
Okay.
transitions out. And the majority of those, maybe 70% of those, are people who are under 30.
I'm gonna
And that's also the majority of the people who come in to replace them.
I'm gonna suggest that we move on to setting up for lunch, and
Yeah.
of course, we can continue to discuss
Yes.
things, but.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.